Welcome to Mapping the Self. I'm Selena Garofino. Know thyself was carved into stone at the entrance of Apollo's temple at Delphi in ancient Greece. Scholars, poets, philosophers have debated the big questions around what it is to know yourself for thousands of years. I invite you to join me for conversations with artists, creators, scholars, spiritual teachers, writers, and humans of all walks of life to discuss these big questions together, to engage in a dialogue around what it is to live fully, to map ourselves, to know ourselves, to grow our compassion and listening, and to explore together our highest possibilities. Welcome. Welcome to Mapping the Self. I am so excited today to introduce you, if you don't know her already, to Amber Ryan. Amber it feels like a diminishing way to say this. She's my dance teacher, but she's so much more than that. Welcome, Amber.
Oh, thank you so much, Selena. It is a pleasure to be here with you.
I would love, just as an opening, for you to explain a little bit about the 360 and your work for our listener, because we have a lot of listeners from different backgrounds and they're not all necessarily in our movement and wellness world. So can you tell us just a little bit about Emergence and your work?
Absolutely. It's my pleasure. Well, one of the things I love to offer is so many people have an aversion to the word dance, or they feel limited by that word. And so one of the words that I love to utilize, because it's more universal, is movement. Humans were always moving from one place to the other. And in this type of movement, part of what we are accentuating is movement as meditation, movement as awareness, movement even as evolution, as self-inquiry and self-discovery. And so a long time ago, I started off as a dancer. I trained in all different types of dance growing up in the studio, tap, jazz, ballet, all of that. And pretty early on, I started to have some injuries in my body. I had my first major injury at the age of 17. I would also hear from people who were older than me in the dance industry saying, the lifespan of a dancer is relatively short because of how much our bodies get taxed along the way. And so in my own evolution and practice, I got introduced to the theater, which I so fell in love with because movement dance was my first language. The spoken word, not so much. So it took me into the theater and creative arts. And because I had trained so much as a dancer, I was getting roles as a dancer in the theater, while at the same time knowing, because of the injuries, that my body was not going to be able to sustain me. So in the year 2000, I met Gabrielle Roth's work, and she was the founder and creator of the 5 Rhythms. And when I met that work, part of what it gifted me was being able to do what I so love to do in the world, which was to dance and to move and to be in my body, yet in a way where, as I heightened my awareness of my own body, I wasn't injuring myself. And so I went on this long journey of studentship with her and that practice, and became a teacher of the 5 Rhythms. It's a practice that I love and I will always love. And throughout time, she passed in 2012. And I also came into a deep love with, I would say, the philosophy of yoga and the ancient teachings of yoga. And that's where I met one of our similar teachers, Rod Stryker, along that path, and really started to, I would say, explore some of the yogic philosophy maps and even some of the movement maps and the meditation maps like Yoga Nidra, and bringing them into an embodiment. And so the 360 emerged with myself and my colleague, Kate Shela, through a few needs. One, when I look at what the foundation or the purpose of, let's say, ecstatic dance or conscious dance is, what it all boils down to in one word is freedom. And so for me as an artist and me as someone who loves to explore and really feel my own freedom to create my life, I was like, I've really dived deeply into this amazing practice of the 5 rhythms. And now what's next? What's next? How do I want to keep evolving and growing, not only as a teacher, but also as a student? And so I began to explore the overlay of different maps. I love mapping. I call myself a map maker.
So you were probably enjoying the name of the podcast.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. It's so resonant, right? It's so resonant. And also the study of what the soul is, what the soul is and what's the difference between soul and spirit. And so the 360 emergence, we really chose the number 360 and the word emergence very consciously. And I'll keep it simple, but when we tune into 360, it's a full circle. And so much of our human orientation physically, somatically, is on the front side of the body. And so when we tune into the practices of grounding and centering and opening up more of what is possible, we started to want to know more about how we could evolve as humans by opening up awareness on the backside body, opening up more sensorial parts of ourselves to heighten our awareness in a good way. And so not only do we have that spatial awareness around our bodies, but within. In the yoga practice, as you so know, we have energy centers, wisdom centers, we like to call it in the 360. And each of those centers are a whole world of study. And so how do we tune into that 360? So if we simply tune into the heart, well, again, most humans, we feel the front side of the heart. Well, what about the back? What about the sides, right? And so this concept really started to emerge for us. And one of the things that we really wanted to indicate in the naming of our new practice is this concept of emergence, because we're always evolving, right? Anytime anything stays static, gets fixed in a place, then we start to lose the creative potential and the evolutionary potential of what it is that wants to emerge as humanity and life on this planet and beyond evolves.
It gets sick too, right? I mean, stagnant water breeds disease.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. That's my short answer.
It was a beautiful answer. I loved it. Emergence is one of my favorite words. I've been writing about it for years, and I lead a retreat to Greece every year called the Emergence. When I was coming out of, I've had 2 abdominal surgeries and had to go down for periods where I couldn't practice any kind of movement without a lot of pain. There was a 1.5 years where I actually couldn't sit up by myself without having to pull on something with my hands because of my abdomen. And during that time is when I started writing about what emergence meant to me, because the root word is so connected to emergency and the root is the same, and how sometimes often, things have to be completely dissolved and severed before there's a rebirth, and those ongoing cycles of death and rebirth that we move through again and again and again. And those ideas of understanding when to cut the death cord and when to birth something. And so for me, that word is so connected again to that 360, that spin of time, the spin of life cycle. And so I just think it's so beautiful. As we move into a little dialogue I want to ask you some questions about movement for healing and emotional health and healing with somatics. But I wanted to I was chatting with Amber just on Instagram before our conversation began, and I mentioned René Descartes. And I think this is a really important thing for the listener. There's a real reclaiming happening right now, I feel, in the world of our somatics, like an awareness again of how important body is and body speaking and the healing that comes via the body. And we don't often recognize how ideas of the past have shaped our global and collective thinking. And it's why it makes me sad that the humanities are dying. Because if we don't have an understanding of the philosophies that uphold us, we're not able to investigate why we're carrying them still. So René Descartes was this great mathematician and philosopher who lived in, off the top of my head, 1550s to 16 something. And he was the man who first said that statement, "I think, therefore I am." And from that time period on, there's been a severing of our relationship to the natural world. To quote my teacher, Martin Shaw, the world lacks reason, and it is the job of man to tutor the native and domesticate the wild. Nature requires handling and enlightening, not a dialogue. This idea was also politically useful. It was both pragmatic and philosophical, creating opportunity for industrial advancement, utilitarianism, and a centralized didactic approach to religion. So we have been living out René Descartes' phrase, I think therefore I am, for hundreds of years. It was from René Descartes that we started talking about the body as a machine and speaking about the body as separate from us and looking at the body mechanistically. And so it's had a really profound impact on modern medicine, our understanding of human psychology. And I feel that it's like the biggest global wound that we all share. And I was remembering one of my favorite old classic books, A Room with a View. There's a line in it where this character, Mr. Emerson, says, "The Garden of Eden, which you place in the past, is really yet to come. We shall enter it when we no longer despise our bodies." So I feel we're kind of in a collective. We're starting to reject René Descartes finally. And I would love for you to speak just in your experience or whatever wisdom you have to share with us about how these practices invite physical healing, invite emotional healing, like what that means for you as a practitioner and teacher.
Well, thank you so much. Wow. I just got an education from you.
I know that's a lot. If you need a second, you can pause.
No. I'm just in awe of your brilliance and your wisdom. And so I want to thank you for that.
That is very kind. Thank you.
And true. Wow. Yes. So part of the migration, I'll say, that we've been taking, not all of us, but little by little, more and more of us, is from the mind-centric place, from really orienting from the neck up into the wisdom of the body. And the image that comes up for me right now is really simple. You know, like when a dog gets bit or has an injury, or even just after it's gotten out of a shower or out of a bath and it shakes off its skin and all the water goes everywhere. It's this place of coming back to our primal nature, sinking below the mind and coming into understanding that this body has so much innate wisdom. And there's lots of simple ways to begin this practice. And part of it, we could even just do it right now, is to take one hand and let it rest on or below the navel. And the other hand, allow it to rest on the heart. And let's all just take a moment and take 3 slow, deep breaths right there. I'm going to be quiet just for a moment. And on these next 2 breaths that you take, I'm going to invite us all to become aware of what it is that we feel or what it is that we hear. I mean, the first thing that I felt in that first breath was my heartbeat. I felt it and I heard it. I mean, how many times a day do we actually feel that? Well, sometimes when we get really nervous, we might feel that heartbeat activate, right? Or when we feel a lot of emotion. But so many of us have been trained socially to bypass the intelligence of the body and the heart. And so part of what we are reclaiming in movement or embodiment practices is this innate understanding that when we allow ourselves to feel from the inside, and listen to the internal landscape rather than getting all of our answers from the outside. When we start to pay attention more to our internal landscape, we become more in tune with who we really are, with what our essence is, and what it is that is really meaningful to us. So for me, when I start to practice, my instincts turn on more, my intuition opens more. So movement as a healing modality really is an inside job. It's allowing ourselves, and movement practice actually trips us up in a way to get us out of the head. There's all kinds of very simple somatics, just like putting one hand on the heart and one hand on the belly and taking a few breaths and feeling what we feel. We start to make that migration. We start to travel the distance from the head-mind centric place to, wow, what does it actually feel like to be in my body right now? With people who are just entering into and making that bridge, we start really simple. One of the very basic practices that we did with my teacher, Gabrielle, over and over and over again was simply walking wherever, direction unknown. You don't even need to know where you're going, but a simple walking meditation of feeling your feet on the earth. So many of us kind of even hover over our bodies because we're thinking all the time, what do I need to do next? What's on the to-do list? We're actually not even fully present and occupying our bodies. So to simply begin to feel our feet on the earth and to simply feel the sensation of breath entering and exiting the body as a practice of presence, the healing can begin right there. Simply, there are real simple healings. And then, of course, there are the big, profound ones that can happen. When we enter into the depth of the dance, let's say this incredible piece of music comes on that moves us and moves our heart, and maybe tears come. Wow. Sometimes those tears can come because there is a story attached to it. And sometimes it's simply energy being moved, something that's been held in the body for a long time or even a short time. We get the experience to feel, sense, and see and move energy so that we are not carrying the burden of a lifetime on our backs.
That was beautiful. That's exactly it. Because for me, when I'm teaching my yoga students and doing somatic coaching with people, presence is sensation. It's the only thing that's right now is sensation and breath. And every single moment that we pause and tap into that, we're present. And of course, there's times, I like to remind people that the goal isn't that you actually need to be embodied 24/7, because daydreaming is a form of disembodiment. And that can be a really beautiful, sweet thing, right? And sometimes we need to override the signals in the body. You're not going to win a marathon if you cave into the body. Do you know what I mean? Like if you're racing, if we're disembodied most of the time, then we don't have that cultivated wisdom to know when to listen and when it's safe and okay to override. And the more you engage with your work and somatic practices, like you said, you build your intuition and you know when to totally surrender and listen to the body, and when it's like, okay, body, we're going to keep pushing just for a little while in this moment for this goal, for this reason. But the problem, and I see it in yoga students, yoga is often a disembodied practice for people because they're always correcting and it's always towards a goal instead of a feeling in practice, instead of the feeling out that you spoke about. And so I think the kind of work that you're doing and this somatic experiencing and all these different coaching modalities around somatics need to find their way back into the yoga space. If I'm honest, I spent 20 years of my yoga practice correcting my body.
Yeah. And what we love to do in the 360 is ultimately a balancing act, because many of us have actually been practicing in this way for decades together. And so there are quite a few of us that are very somatically attuned. And so now where it is how do I balance it all out? How do I instinctually, okay, right now is a mind moment. Yeah, we're going to go for that. It's going to have the support of the body, or it's going to be connected to the heart, right? Or, wow, I'm having such an emotional outburst right now, or feeling lots of feelings. So what is the sensation? How can I give these feelings a home in the body so I don't become overwhelmed by them? So in a way, the 360 is here to not only heighten awareness, but to balance us out, to allow that awareness to bring us into a greater state of equilibrium. Yeah. And the other thing that you picked up on that I want to name about, let's say, ecstatic dance, conscious dance, movement meditation, I like to just say the dance, right? Because the dance is such a medicine into itself. One of the things that's really different than the yoga practice, which I know we both have a big love for, is that this type of moving is really authentic. So there's no steps. They're not taught to you. So it's something that comes and it emerges from the inside, or the way that we start to teach beginner or even just warming up the body is, I'm going to let my wrists move however they want to. How does it feel to move my rib cage right now? And so through that, we start to heighten awareness in different parts of the body. And little by little, we open up the channels of the body so that energy can flow more freely through it. But in its simple form, it's authentic movement. And some of us, especially in the beginning, need a bridge to be built so that we feel safe and secure, whatever that means, right? But so that we feel like we have a foundation from which we can explore what our own individual authentic movement is. We could even call it free form movement.
Totally. And it's so interesting. I'm sure you're familiar with Peter Levine's work, In an Unspoken Voice, one of his books talking about the body. And I might have this number wrong. I don't have the book in front of me, but the nervous system initiates movement like 300 milliseconds before you've had the thought to do the movement. So when you're moving freeform like that, it's actually like the nervous system is flossing itself. It's doing exactly what it needs and wants to do. So you can't do it wrong. Like when people feel like they're faking it, which is sometimes feedback I get during somatic work, they're like, yeah, but I'm making myself do it. And I'm like, but it's deeper than that, because your nervous system and something more primal in you is actually initiating the movement before you had a chance to think about it. And you can't mess it up. It's right because it's you. And that invitation to, like you said, that authenticity and that connection to a deeper core part of ourselves is such a gift. And then we get to carry that into other things that we do. You're more confident when you're speaking. You have better boundaries because you're aware of where you need them in a way that you're not if you're always overriding. And your stress cup doesn't get as full because emotions don't get stuck, they get stacked. And when you allow them in like the space of the dance for them to just move through you, they don't get stacked. And so they don't get stuck. And that's another way in which I feel this practice is so healing.
Yeah, it absolutely is. The other side of that is that we are habitual creatures, right? And so for those of us, again, who've been moving in this way for a long time, we'll start to notice patterns of movement that emerge. But when we notice them, then we'll, okay, well, instead of going to the right side for the 15,000th time, what about going left, right? And then something new emerges, right? And that's also such a juicy, exciting place to see, to feel, to witness.
Or moving jagged when you tend to be someone who's very sinuous to like, I'm going to put some jagged sort of quotation marks, ugly movement into what I'm doing right now and see what it unshakes from the body and from my system.
Oh yeah, I love that. Oftentimes I will cue people to dance messy. Let's let go of this idea, this concept of perfection, and let ourselves be as messy as our lives are, right? Because there's so much freedom in that, right? And then there's a relief in that freedom. All right, that we don't have to get it quote unquote right all the time, because that's not what we're going after. I like to say a lot of times these days, we're not going for perfection, we're going for presence, right? We're going for authenticity.
Yeah, and it's not a performance. And I think that's part of one of the difficulties when people are new to this kind of work. I know for me, it was really difficult. The very first time we met was in Costa Rica at Elena Brower's retreat at Blue Spirit, and you came and led a 5 rhythm session. And I was a ballet dancer my whole life and modern dance. And when I quit dance, it was such a pain point for me, the dieting stuff in ballet culture and the abuse on my body and never being good enough. And I had all this stuff. And that first night that I danced with you, I've never been so uncomfortable in all my life. And it wasn't you, like I fell in love with you immediately. I'm still here. But it was, I had so many years of perfectionism and the ballet stuff in my body. And I remember just like not knowing what to do with my body that night, like being so uncomfortable, which was very strange for me because I was like, you love to dance, you tango, you love to dance. And I couldn't, there was this like very painful hump. I cried and cried that night after that first exploration, but I also was compelled to continue.
You really point to something that I hear a lot from those folks who have really trained in ballet, especially because it is in certain ways so rigid, and the culture itself is so challenging. And so there's a deconstruction that usually happens for those that are trained dancers to come into that state of free form. So I want to thank you for sharing so vulnerably and for mentioning that.
Yeah. I think it's important. And even non-dancers that are coming into this kind of work, we have such a thing in our culture about performing. Yoga is often a performance nowadays in the modern West. If I had a critique of it, it would maybe be that there's a lot of performative things in our culture, and it's what we equate with success as a successful performance. And I think people, when they're new, I've had feedback from people exploring somatics and dance, how challenging it is to let go of the idea that they're supposed to be making something pretty or be performing. And I would love it if maybe you have some insight for beginners coming into somatic freeform movement.
Yeah, thank you. Well, one of the things that comes to mind first with that is, there's also with that performative and making the body do something that it doesn't really want to do. I've heard from many doctors now, there's so many runners and yogis that have been in their 40s getting knee and hip replacements. And so this place of really slowing down to be able to listen to the body and what it is that it wants to do is one of the first big steps in entering into this realm. It's a threshold crossing, again, from the mind into the intelligence of the body. And as someone who does have hip issues and also had an abdominal surgery and ankles and all of these things, it's the foundation of my practice is to come into a state of listening. So for the beginner, there are actually some really, again, like beautiful crossovers with the yoga practice. And one of those is just simply standing in mountain pose, standing in Tadasana. In the 360, we call it standing in zero. And for us, that zero place is, first of all, like feeling again the feet on the earth and coming into a good alignment with ourselves. I mean, there's so many on the planet now that, let's say, have a posture that doesn't allow for the heart to be open. So many times when we're walking down the street, the eyes are on the pavement rather than in our maturity of being able to see the world around us and having the courage to be seen. And I know that brings up a lot of nerves for a lot of us, yet that's happening all the time. So in our beginning practices, just this beautiful stance of presence with both feet on the earth, not leaning over to one side or the other, but coming into a place of accessing our own center, right? And so the center line, we could start it above the crown of the head and use our imagination or our felt sense to draw a line down through the crown, down through the midbrain, through the throat center, through the spine, all the way down through the pelvic floor, right there, beautiful line that goes between your legs towards the earth below. And, and this is something, and it's why it's practice. We do this every session, like feeling that connection to the earth. When we feel that connection to the earth, there it is right there. It drops us below the mind and into a felt present moment experience. So these types of very basic practices is how we begin 360 sessions of finding our center. And finding center, it is a practice because it's just like balance. It's ever changing.
Yeah, I always call it the moving middle.
The moving middle. I love it. Because we take one step and now we're in transition, right? And life is a transition. And so we get to practice being in these very small transitions that prepare us for the big transitions of life. But in its simple form, in the 360, we're coming back to center as home, as a landing ground again and again and again. That is very practical. And then as we begin to move and open up our moving, it can also go into quite a magical place, a place where metaphor and story and dream and wakefulness and dream time, all of that start to become alive within the body. And when that is happening, we are healing. We are in a state of transformation. I'm hearing some New York City sounds behind me. I don't know.
I love it. I am hearing them, but I don't mind it at all. Okay. I love New York City. I was actually just like, oh, she's in New York. I hear New York. If you know, you know.
Yeah, right. I never thought I'd return, and here I am, have returned to New York for the 15,000th time. I love it here.
I do too. I love New York City. It's a really special place. Yeah, we drop in the same way. And I mean, in all the yoga traditions, right? The Sushumna, the gracious stream, the Tai Chi, the Sutra Atman, the thread of the self, the Axis Mundi, in the Kabbalah traditions, like many spiritual traditions speak of the importance of that central line. And I always love to drop in right at the beginning of my Katona practices with the dialogue under the ground of the mushrooms and fungi and all this big dialogue that's happening. And we speak of it in Katona yoga as the umbilical cord to the planet that is below you. The soul drops in and the spirit rises. So then we have the universal and the spirit above the crown of the head, and that sort of vibrancy of the flesh in the middle. The body is a tuning fork. And you're right. It's just such a simple way to just drop into the body in any given moment when you're feeling overwhelmed, when there's a difficult conversation, when anything. And the more you practice it, the quicker you can pull that anchor state in an instant when you need it. But you have to put the time in building that in your day to day so that when there is an emergency, you can access it quickly.
Well said. Yeah, that's what practice is for, right? It's like we hone, we spend the minutes, the hours, the days, the weeks, and cultivating a practice so that when life happens in a big way, it's there for us. And if we're doing practices that are not accessible when we're having a big moment, then we get to question, okay, is there another practice that can come in to support moments like these? Because those are the ones that help support us on the daily, the weekly, the monthly, the yearly, and our emotional state. And when the unexpected happens, these very simple foundational practices are really what holds us.
Khenpo Rinpoche, who is one of the Tibetan monks, I live very near some place called the Ewam Garden of 1,000 Buddhas, and it's a Tibetan monastery and peace center. And Khenpo Rinpoche told me that you should practice like your hair is on fire. And I never forgot it. He giggled afterwards. Someone translated it from Tibetan, and he was just smiling at me. It was just like, practice like your hair's on fire.
I can see the twinkle.
Oh, he is such a twinkle. He's a total delight. One time I brought a bunch of students there for their graduation from their 200-hour yoga teacher training. And he gave them a talk and stuff. And then he was out there in his robes photographing them while they were doing yoga poses. And he was just laughing his head off. And then during his talk, he said, it's so funny in the West because you have all these yoga people and they're obsessed with yoga asana and they do all these poses all the time and they're always correcting their bodies, but they don't take care of their hearts and their minds. So they live a long time and suffer with their healthy hearts and bodies. And he giggles. And then he goes, and the monks, we take care of only our hearts and our minds and we eat too many biscuits and we die too young.
Oh, what a wonderful being.
And I laughed and laughed. But I was like, oh, he's so right. Like so many of our wellness practices are so body-centric in not the way you and I are talking about body-centric, but body as object upon which we enact through control wellness. And it's in a sort of disconnected power over sort of way instead of a relational way, back to Descartes. And when he said that, I was like, oof, like it just hit me right in the core of my being, even though it was so playful. I was like, he's right.
Yeah. Look at that. I bet that made some shifts for you, huh?
It did. I sat with that all day long. Every time I see him, he says something. That one time I asked him, I'll give you one more anecdote and then I'm going to ask you another question. I had a couple of really difficult students at the time in my life. And I called him and asked him if I could come see him. And so I came to the Buddha Garden and grabbed the translator, the Nepali translator, because I speak a fair bit of Nepali. And so we went to sit down with him, and I'm explaining to him this difficulty and how I don't know how to help my student. And he says, and I quote, "When the Lama enters the room and takes the throne, the disturbed minds go quiet." And I was like, he just told me to practice more. Like be the cool water. And I hold that now every time I step in to teach. I'm like, it's my job to be the cool water, the cooling stream.
Oh, that is beautiful. I love that. I'm going to take that one and sit with that one.
Please. I was like, well, this meeting's over. There's nothing else to say, And then he handed me a plate of biscuits, of cookies.
Thank you for your 30 seconds of wisdom. It just changed my life.
Yep, that was all I needed to hear. And now we eat cookies and have tea. Perfect. Back to business. Yeah, the cool water. Just be cool water. I walked away from that too as a teacher. Like, of course, we're not responsible for other people's behaviors or thoughts. That's called codependency. And as the teacher, sometimes, especially if it's prolific, the students are a reflection of us, was what I took away from that.
Yeah, that's beautiful. I'm going through a few scenarios in my mind right now, doing some cleanup work. Oh yeah, there it is.
Always the endless cleanup work, right? So I ask everyone what self-mastery is. And obviously it's like the age-old question. So I don't know if there's an answer, but I like to kind of hear from people about their sort of practical answer. Like in the day-to-day, how do I execute a level of self-mastery? And then maybe if you have anything that is on your heart or mind in this moment, it could change later, about what kind of the bigger question of what is self-mastery.
Yeah, I sit with that a lot, actually. One of the terms that I've received from my yoga teacher friends is householder, that we're householders. We're not the Lama, we're not the monks. We're here in the day-to-day with children, with buying groceries, with the task, paying bills, the things that we have to do to make this life work for us. And so there's this place of coming into a realistic, practical, as you say, like relationship with this concept of self-mastery. And for me, self-mastery is very much like that word balance that we were talking about, that it's elusive, and on different days, different aspects of myself are going to show up. And so one of the things that kind of guides my life is practice and presence. The way that presence and awareness helps us bring choices, helps us make choices. And the more that I am aware, the more I have the option to choose. And because I am human, I'm not always going to choose the higher path, And so I try to practice this concept of self-mastery with a lot of self-compassion. Because as much as I might think I know what the right answer is, or the thing that I should do in this moment, sometimes my emotional state takes me in a different direction. And I then am going to have the opportunity to circle back around and meet that moment again in a different way, right? And so this place of freedom, I'll just return to that word again. I don't want to be too hard on myself, because I've seen what being really hard on myself can do to my own psyche, and how the mind loops, and how I can be really hard on myself. But one of the things that over the past 4 or 5 years I've really been tuning into is, am I happy? And for quite a while there, I was not coming up with the answer of yes. And so I was really going into a place and space of inquiry of, if life is how it is, and this is how it is, and it's not going to change in these kinds of ways, what can I do or not do to allow myself to achieve some sort of baseline happiness where I feel good about being alive? I feel good about being a contribution. And so when we go through that and start to look at, okay, how much of this is external and how much of this is internal? And what do I really have, let's say, quote unquote, control over? And what I started to, of course, come to as well, the externals, I don't have a lot. I mean, I have the choice of where I'm going to live. Am I going to live in Colorado or Brooklyn? These types of things, Costa Rica or Florida. I have navigation control around those things. I don't necessarily have control over if my beloved is showing up when I really want a beloved to be showing up or not, right? And so what is it that I can cultivate to achieve some base level of happiness? And so as far as self-mastery, I would say I'm very much still on the path of that. It's not something that I've achieved for long periods of time. There's been moments where I'm like, oh, there it is. I have golden key now. I'm never going back. I now understand all of this. And then the way that life seems to present itself to me is, okay, that's one layer. That's, let's say, maybe a new echelon of awareness or understanding that I've come to. And wow, there's so much more that's possible, right? And so with what is given now, with what it is that I have to work with now, can I come to a state of enjoyment? And a lot of that right now leads to that word balance. Am I resting enough? Am I spending time with friends? Am I connecting with my family? Am I being stimulated by the arts? Do I have enough time to read a book or write in my journal? And I'll honestly say, cultivating, curating, being a co-founder of an emergent movement practice presents a lot of challenges in the way of balance. And so this is something that we talk about in the 360 a lot, because we can look at all of this as the practice arena, but then there's also, because we are householders, am I paying my bills? Is this startup company thriving? And then the stresses that can come in with all of those things. So this summer, I started a new meditation practice because I started to feel like I was disconnected from spirit. Being connected to spirit and the divine is very important to me, because if that's something that I'm not feeling connected to, then that baseline of happiness is simply not there for me. And so I recommitted to some of my meditation practice, some of my yogic meditation practices, and I started a new practice of Vedic meditation. And that practice has really shifted my life. It's been about 9 months now. And self-mastery, have I done it every single day? No. Most days, yes, which is a big state of progress for me. But entering into some form of daily practice, and for me right now, it is that Vedic meditation practice, it is helping to create that baseline of wellness and well-being. And so that's been just really important, a really important aspect of my own health, well-being, and evolution.
I love how you answered that question, because the thread in all of it was you basically just said self-mastery is endless practice. That was the thread you just kept coming back to. No, it was beautiful, but I was following the thread, and I was practice, 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 practice.
Yeah. When I see friends, colleagues, students go into deep state of, let's say, unwellness or extreme stress, huge amounts of emotionality, my question is are you practicing? Are you practicing? And what are your practices?
And then sometimes, and I just want to say for the listener too, and then sometimes those things happen in spite of. There's prolonged ill health or something that comes along, and then it becomes even more important to continue to hold the practice in those moments when you can lose faith that they're helping because of prolonged chronic illness or chronic pain, and the impact that can have on just the chemicals in your body. And how you can lose faith because it's not working. I'm still not feeling how I used to feel in this difficult moment. Well, that's when we have to have some faith that the practice is still serving, and it could be worse.
Yeah, it usually can be worse.
If we weren't practicing, it could be worse. I hurt my neck really badly a couple of years ago, and then I didn't know how bad the neck injury was, and it progressed. Because at the time I was doing martial arts still after the neck injury, which I didn't realize. I thought it was my shoulder, and I didn't realize the shoulder pain was coming from the nerves in my neck. So I was misdiagnosed for a long time until I just like went down with severe migraines and like really, I've had a very debilitating over a year now. I'm coming out the other side of it and moving again and like having more and more pain-free days. And I've had surgeries and stuff in the past and experienced those humblings around dependency on physical movement for my well-being, which might sound contradictory to our listeners since we just spent so much time talking about movement as medicine. But, you know, the times I've had surgeries and had to unravel my meditation, my wellness practices from being able to move physically. And I thought that I had already nailed that thing. Do you know what I mean? Like I was like, oh yeah, I don't have to move. I have these other heart, mind, soul building practices. But I tell you what, when my neck got hurt, it was like another layer. I was like, oh no, you're still super attached to being able to move your body for identity as your healing practice, as the way in which you disperse energy, all the implications, reasons that we use movement. And I've softened into myself in such a deeper way in the last year because my practice became sitting, just simple Zen meditation. I didn't even have the mental capacity to do some of the Kriyas and whatnot that you and I both practice that we've learned from Rod Stryker and other shared teachers. I didn't even have the headspace for that. And so I adopted a Zen practice of just sitting, and the softening into myself and the unraveling that has happened through all of that pain has brought me to another layer of that baseline joy that you're speaking of like, how do we hold a net of compassion that is big enough to be in pain and still have joy, to be experiencing grief and loss and still have joy, to not turn our back on the horrible, painful things that are happening in the world that really need our attention and still have joy.
Definitely a practice to be able to behold both, to be able to be with the vast polarities that this life offers to us. Because when we are in a state of oneness, all of those polarities dissolve, right? They dissolve into that unified field. And whatever it is that you call source, that we call source, God, creator, goddess, a lot of our time on the day to day we spend in these different aspects of holding the polarities of life. And, you know, even with, as you were speaking about moving more into a Zen practice because of physical limitations, we can also tune into in that internal landscape, there's so much movement happening, right? Even the rise and the fall of the breath, there's movement happening in the body. All the cells, the 72 trillion cells in the body, they're moving, right? They're alive with life.
Yeah, it is still movement. And that was the focal point, was just watch the breath. Let's just watch the belly move. I would lay there and sense, because I had to lay down and I had so much pain in my head and my neck, and it was so constricted, you know, the muscles around my skull. And I would envision, because it's a real thing, the bones separating as I inhaled in my skull, that like little gentle separation of the bones and the fluid moving around the brain. And that became the practice, right? Was just that, like that washing of the fluid. I mean, you just said the movement, like when you breathe in, we have this like glymphatic system in the brain, and cerebral spinal fluid, when you inhale, like literally moves up and helps start this process of like, I'm going to use poetic language, but washing the brain, washing the mind. When you retain an inhale, like things we're just learning. And when you exhale, it continues that washing of cerebral spinal fluid back down out of the brain. So there's like these cycles happening even in our experienced stillness that we can tune into that are so beautiful.
Yeah. And, you know, hopefully life is long and we have an opportunity to practice all different types of things, and that we can know in a given day, what is the practice that's best going to serve me today? And in the 360 Emergence, this is part of what we are wanting to open the movement community to, is like, yeah, well, within this experience, we can also see how seated meditation can be supportive to movement meditation, how yoga nidra can open us into the different awarenesses of the dream, sleeping, waking state, and how it's all connected. And the more is that we steep into daily practice, from writing to reading to, you know, all these amazing modern and ancient arts, that we can continue to build our medicine bag, our toolkit, right, in order to help us live lives of meaning, really, that we feel really good and that we can feel our contribution to the world and feel really good within ourselves.
Yeah, it's so important because happiness is an emotion, and like all emotions, it moves. And so we're not always going to be, and I don't mean the happiness you were talking about, but like what Kate Tempest calls the brand happiness, as it's sold to us, like we're not always going to be in that kind of happiness. But we can find meaning, purpose, and fulfillment in every moment. And those are self-created. It takes a human heart to create meaning. And so we get to decide how we're interpreting and reframing and framing every moment as it comes, and creating a life of purpose and intention. Because then when things are maybe not that brand happiness and there's difficult moments, we still have that. We can still be fulfilled even in sadness or difficulties or loss. So I think what you're speaking to is just so important.
Yeah, absolutely. Well said. I mean, we're humans. We're going to experience all of those emotions, right?
That's right. Yeah. That's in one of the Tantra lineages that I studied with Dr. Douglas Brooks. That's Kali's yoga, is that we're promised every experience from revelry to rage to sorrow. And that the description in those Southern Indian texts about Kali's yoga is that we gather our experience. It describes us like little bees gathering nectar, and that we bring them back partially digested to the kula, to the community where they're vomited up. This is how honey is made. And they are digested by the community and fed back to us as the honey that nourishes all. Isn't that beautiful?
It's so beautiful.
Well, we just have a couple minutes left. And so I just want to give you an opportunity to explain how people can work with you. Presently, I just finished a program called Compass with Amber, and I'm doing her program, The Seer, right now, which is incredible. And I would love for you to just tell the people how they can come and work with you.
Thank you. Well, in this modern moment, we have this amazing tool called Zoom, where during the time that we were all in our houses and living life in a different way, we were really practicing online a lot. And so, one of the beauties of that is no matter where it is that you live, you can tap into that. I'll be back online starting once a month. And over time, we're going to rebuild our weekly offering of the 360 online so that those that aren't living in cities where it's happening have access. Whenever you see an immersion that you can get to, a retreat, a weekend, a drop-in class, that's the place where it's the most interactive. In a yoga class, usually you're on a mat and most people facing the same direction. In this type of practice, it really is 360. So to be able to gift yourself an in-person experience is wonderful, and it's dynamic, and it really accelerates the healing process and the transformation process. Yet that said, so much of what we do in person can be done in your own living room. So you can check out our website, the360emergence.com, and see a whole array of offerings there. Kate Shela and I are going to be in Costa Rica in July for a 5-day immersion. I'm even going to be touring Europe again. I used to teach a lot in Europe. So that's going to be starting New York City, Boulder, Los Angeles. And right now we're training our first circle of apprentices who will soon be out in the world offering all over the place, from Austria to Colombia, different places in the US, Australia. And so it's wonderful to be in this emergent time where the work is spreading. And so lots of different ways. And, again, you can feel into your own excitement when you check out that website and see where the call is. And feel free to email. My email is amber@the360emergence.com, and happy to tune in with anyone who is tuning into this amazing podcast.
Amazing. And I will put all your website and social handles in the show notes for our listener as well. I just want to say too, I've been doing it online because I wasn't able to travel right now, and it's so rich. So if you have some hesitancy around getting the experience online, I did Compass and I repeated all of the classes as many times as I could while we had access to them. It was, even doing them on repeat was so rich. I went to a different place, another layer, even though it wasn't live when I was watching the recordings, it felt like I still was. And so I just want to encourage the listener not to feel like that. is something that would hold them back, but it's really worth exploring.
That is great to hear. Thank you so much.
Absolutely. And I just started the Seer, and it feels like you're in the room with me. So it's lacking in nothing.
Oh, thank you. Thanks for the work you're doing. It's so wonderful to be with your brilliant heart and mind and what it is that you're creating and sharing with the world. So thank you so much for the good work you're doing.
Thank you. That feeling is very mutual. Thank you so much, Amber.
Thanks, Serena.